the Soviets very quickly realized who he was, his former role as the governor in Volhynia for 10 years. They knew that he had a lot of information about, because being the governor of Volhynia, this was also the border between Poland and the Soviet Union at the time. And the Polish military intelligence was quite interested in the disintegration of the Soviet Union and even Russia itself into its constituent ethnic parts. So they had this project, the Prometheism project, where they supported various national movements. So, for example, the Ukrainians living in the Soviet Union, or the various Ugro-Turkic tribes in Siberia, or the various Turkic tribes in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and so on. So the Poles, they would send agents that would travel between the borders, Volhynia being one of those places, meaning that the governor was also involved in a lot of that secret work. And he would also take in reports, finding out what is going on in the Soviet Union. For example, he was very well informed about the Holodomor, that was this starvation famine that was targeting especially the Ukrainians in 1933. He simply had a lot of dirt on the Soviets, and he had already proved that he was willing to work against them. He had spoken out publicly in these underground publications, and simply put, the communists were after him. However, he was excellent at this underground work. He quickly realized that Warsaw was too hot, having been a governor in one of the provinces of the country. His face was easy to recognize in the capital city, and he decided that moving to the so-called recovered territories, the parts of that had been Germany before the Second World War and had been given to Poland after the Second World War, this was a place where Poles had arrived from all over, especially from the parts of the so-called Kresy borderlands that now had become parts of the Soviet Union, belonging to the Belarusian and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist republics. All of those refugees had been moved, or many of them had been moved to the recovered territories in Western Poland. And in general, all Poles that had been uprooted during the war, they had lost their homes in various German pacification operations and so on, or people who had lost their families and thought that they wanted a fresh start somewhere far away from home. Many of them moved to those areas. So you had this mix of people. There were no neighbors that had known each other for 20 years or so. There was just this general, slightly chaotic situation, and a good place if you wanted to hide from the authorities. So he would live there for a couple of years, but then he would also move around to the Lublin region, and he managed to not be captured for many years, which was quite unusual, because in that totalitarian system that the Stalinists imposed on Poland, both the Soviet and the Polish communist military intelligence and regular intelligence, they had very good knowledge about who was who, where they lived, and all of these information that they needed to capture whoever they were out after. So usually people could maybe stay away for 6 months, 8 months, maybe up to a year, but sooner or later they would get caught. There would be some informer somewhere. But Józefski managed to stay on free foot between 1945 and 1953, so for a good 8 years.
Yes, yes.
And this is probably also what saved his life, because had he been captured a little bit earlier, it's quite likely that he would have received a death sentence. But he was captured just as Joseph Stalin had died. And because of that, conditions were slightly different. Instead, he received a life sentence, which was later commuted, and he became a free man after a couple of years in prison. And he went on to live into the early 1980s, 1981, if I'm not mistaken. And he had been also an acclaimed artist, writer. Naturally, writing was out of the question in those years with his baggage, so to say. But he was also a good painter and did a little bit of sculpturing as well. So he became quite an appreciated member of the artistic circles in the 60s and partly in the 70s. So he managed to retreat from politics and just remain in the world of culture. Also, he had very good contacts even before the war. One of his good friends, Stanisław Stemkowski, the other Pole who was a minister in the Ukrainian People's Republic, he had become the life partner of Maria Dąbrowska, who was an excellent novelist and nominated for the Nobel Prize several times. She had introduced Józefski to these artistic circles, the so-called Scamandrites, that was one of the main collectives of poetry that was the most famous. So he already had that fame as an artist in the interwar era, even though he had to focus on being a governor. But in the 60s, he returned to that circle, and he naturally tried to have good relations with the Ukrainians as well, even though there had been the so-called Vistula action after the war, during which most Ukrainians had either been deported forcibly to the Soviet Union and the Soviet part of Ukraine, or they had been moved from the eastern areas of Poland to various other parts of Poland to disseminate them in a way so that there wouldn't be a large Ukrainian population, as naturally the background was that there was this genocide that took place in 1943, and later on the Poles and the Ukrainians, they kept fighting for quite a while. So it took a good 4 years before that active phase of fighting ended. And Józefski tried to rebuild some better relations, but the Ukrainian population in Poland was, one, it was very small at the time, and two, they had been heavily repressed in communist Poland, so it wasn't really an environment in which that type of work could function. So unfortunately, Józefski died in 1981 and felt that his big mission in life had failed, unfortunately.
But in many ways, very interesting story.
And today there is a chance, naturally, for those that
these ideas are being raised again, which is very interesting. Alas, we will look at that in the future, but on this occasion we must end the programme because the clock in the corner of the room has defeated us. But thank you.
Thank you.
Well, a very interesting canter through the course of a key part of Polish-Ukrainian relations leading up to the Second World War, and as Adam said just afterwards, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Poland Daily History. Thank you for watching.